very few organizations have dedicated staff, and very few responded with a filled out questionnaire. So what lessons can we use? And here I'll borrow Dietram's lessons instead of additional thoughts, because these are lessons that we thought we learned from this effort. Future efforts to obtain input from organizations that apply risk perception studies should occur with the express support of national or EU authorities. We have to have some oomph behind our questionnaire in order to sort of not necessarily twist arms, but motivate responding organizations to be involved. Indeed, we may need to expand the schedule and funding to allow for individual face-to-face interviews at the different organizations. And this effort could also serve as an initial starting point for the development of a European network of expert stakeholders on evidence-based risk perception studies in risk communication of chemicals and consumer products and articles. This will go hand in hand, such a network development should go hand in hand with the development of an expansion of competency centers at national and European authorities. This is right now, there are several competency centers being developed. Some are being expanded. However, we do not have yet a strategic plan that will implement this on a national or European scale. These competency centers could also serve as focal points for further methods, evaluation, and improvements, as well as training and guideline development, which were identified as needs by the respondents in our survey. Clearly, we have to have more evidence-based risk perception studies. They're sorely needed in the area of chemicals and consumer products. What did we do in order to create a web-based reference database? Well, we first classified what references we collected, and we did that by type of source documents, by the underlying methodology, and I'll get into that here in a second, where we looked at what's the methodology that was underlying the study that was published here. Is it the psychometric paradigm, intuitive toxicology, mental models, cultural theory? And we looked at the study type. Was it an experimental, qualitative setting, survey? What kind of study type was it? Target groups, we can identify different target groups. Chemical issues, endpoint, and special focus. And then research and development needs or research needs. So these are the classification classifiers that we developed into a Wikindex database. This is not the final database, as the EC will disseminate, but right now this is what we have developed as a work product, which will be implemented into a larger scale reference database. So what elements were there in the state-of-the-art report? Well, first we introduced the risk perception research field pertaining to chemicals and consumer products and articles. We looked at the different approaches of how risk perception research is organized. And here I'll have cultural theory of risk in reference to Dan Kahn. We can also call it cultural organization of risk. But we then also looked at additionally current perspectives on risk perception, where we looked at the role of affect in risk perception. This is something that Leonard Sierberg was mentioning, as well as others today. The influence of personality traits, and finally the risk perception of consumer products containing chemicals. We discussed each of these approaches, both based on the methodological requirements, the usefulness for understanding risk perception, and this is where I mentioned the rubber meets the road for informing strategies for risk communication. Our evaluations, and this is a big caveat to our results that I will show here and our evaluations that I will present here in a second. Our evaluations were performed with the specific focus of chemicals released from consumer products and articles. Within this constraint, which clearly could be considered to be subjective, we evaluated the methods with objective characteristics. So our tight framing, and this is the framing that's not the same as the framing that Rob and Dan were mentioning before. Within this tight framing, we did our best job at being as objective as possible. So given that caveat and given that history, what do we think are the benefits of the various methodological approaches to informing risk communication for chemicals released from consumer products and articles? Well, the psychometric paradigm is a survey-based method. It looks at multiple hazards and multiple risk characteristics. Excuse me. It yields very useful information on how different hazards are perceived in regard to a specific set of risk characteristics. The parentheses on average is very important because psychometric paradigm obviously has a major disadvantage or major drawback. It looks at averages. If we were to think in terms of cultural organization, where we recognize that people fit into different boxes, if you will, different quadrants, averaging them out doesn't make much sense. So that is a drawback here. The usefulness for informing strategies for risk communication. Risk may mean to lay people that more than probability and severity. Clear insight that should be transferred into risk communication strategies. However, it provides little information on how to actually design risk communication strategies. The cultural theory of risk. It is typically a survey approach that currently and comparatively to the psychometric paradigm has little empirical support as of yet. Hopefully in a few years Dan will have generated much more empirical support and looks at primarily the theoretical values orientation and grouping people into those different orientation values. It's useful for understanding risk perception. Not useful was our take on our specific focus. Remember the caveat that I mentioned. Usefulness for informing strategies for risk communication. Not that useful for chemicals released from consumer products and articles. I'll be happy to take questions about that later. Stigma approach. It's a survey. It uses free associations, typically images. Usefulness for understanding risk perception, not applicable to all risks, but emphasizes the role of affect in risk perception. Usefulness for informing strategies for risk communication, it calls attention to the limits of providing factual information. And it emphasizes the role of contextual information framing. Very important. Several speakers have already mentioned that. Intuitive toxicology. Well, it also uses surveys, and it looks at the scientific toxicology in terms of what do the public, lay people, intuitively understand about it. The usefulness for understanding risk perception is the best for excuse me, for what our topic was. It provides information where and how much lay perceptions diverge from scientific toxicology. Thus, intuitive toxicology can provide a lot of insight about why lay